One of the things I'm most passionate about is using music theory as a way of increasing our appreciation and understanding of classical music. So today we're going to take a deep dive into the concept of the musical interval. And we're going to explore how Bach uses one musical interval in particular for expressive purposes. For those of you with some music theory chops, some of this is going to feel like treading familiar ground, but stick with it until the end. I think that by that point, we'll have a much better understanding of the expressive power of intervals. When we listen to a fugue, the first thing we hear is the subject, a single line of melody, entirely alone and unaccompanied. This is the theme of the fugue, and once it's been heard, each voice enters with that same theme in turn. Let's listen to how that works in the opening section, called the exposition, of the C-sharp minor fugue. So what makes this particular theme, the subject, so expressive? Well, I think it comes down to Bach's use of one interval in particular, and that interval is the diminished fourth. First, a little exploration of intervals. An interval is basically the difference in pitch between two notes. These two notes could be played simultaneously, in which case we talk about a harmonic interval, or they could be played sequentially, which is called a melodic interval. Today, we're just going to focus on melodic intervals. So how does this work? Well, there are a couple ways to look at it. One way is to just count the number of semitones, i.e. halftones, between notes. One semitone is a minor second, two semitones a major second, three semitones a minor third, four semitones a major third, five semitones a perfect fourth, and so on and so on. But it's not actually quite that simple. That's because in Western tonal music, intervals are most commonly understood within the context of a key or scale. For example, the C major scale looks like this. In this system, we determine an interval by counting the number of steps we travel on the staff, and then we add an adjective like major, minor, or diminished to describe the quality of that interval. If we start at C and go up one step, we get a second. What kind of second, though? Well, it's a major second because there are two semitones between the two notes. And if we go up another second from there, we arrive at a major third, which contains four semitones between notes. So far, this seems exactly the same as just counting half steps. But let's look at another situation. How about we take C-sharp minor, the same key as our fugue? In this scale, going up a step still gets us a major second, but when we go up another step, we arrive at a minor third, because there are only three semitones between notes. Just to recap, it's a third because there are two steps between the notes, and it's minor because of the number of semitones separating those notes. Okay, so now let's extend our scale down by one step at the bottom with B sharp. How about the interval between B sharp and E? Well, counting steps, we get a fourth. And what kind of fourth is it? If you recall, the perfect fourth we saw earlier had 5 semitones, but in this case, counting them, there are only 4 semitones between these notes. As we saw earlier, an interval containing 4 semitones is usually a major third. So what gives? Is this note a third or a fourth? The answer, of course, is that it's a diminished fourth, since it's 1 semitone smaller than the perfect fourth. But that's also the secret to why this interval is so interesting and expressive. If we take that same interval but spell it differently, say from C to E, we have a totally boring, mundane major third. But take that interval and put it into another context with another spelling, from B sharp to E, and all of a sudden the interval has a new expressive power. It's almost transgressive. And this is the secret of what makes this interval so powerful in Bach's music as well. For 17th century musicians, this was a very useful interval that could be used for powerful rhetorical purposes. Christoph Bernhard, 17th century German composer and theorist, describes this interval, the diminished fourth, as part of what he calls the saltus duriusculus, the somewhat difficult leap. Composers used difficult leaps, like the diminished fourth, as a way of expressing harshness and anguish. In particular, they used it when they wanted to paint images of the crucifixion of Christ. Bach participates in this tradition as well, as is probably best exemplified by the chorus from the St. Matthew Passion, Lass ihn kreuzigen, that contains exactly this interval at its core. Why does any of this matter? After all, Bach's C-sharp minor fugue doesn't contain any text. It doesn't have any mentions of crosses or kreuzigen or anything of the like. I think that Bach's keyboard music often rather unfairly gets a reputation for being abstract or difficult to interpret. In the case of Bach's texted works, like his cantatas, it's much easier to figure out what they mean because there are texts attached to the music. But when we start looking at 17th and 18th century conceptions of musical rhetoric, it becomes easier to understand how Bach could in fact paint images, ideas, and words through humble musical materials like intervals. And recognizing this opens us to the expressive universe of Bach's keyboard music.